Rest. We all need it. It's just a physical fact of life, right? We all have our sleep cycles, day and night, right? We need so many hours of sleep every night. We need physical rest. And there is that saying, oh, just give it a rest. You know, right? People just need rest. Physically, mentally, emotionally. Get off of it, leave it alone. It's true of our bodies, our minds, our hearts, our souls. And Jesus even promised, come to me, all you who are heavily laden, and I will give you rest. A break from, all your stresses and businesses. Actually, Jesus has a great deal to say about rest and what rest really is, because he healed people on the Sabbath. He gave them relief from infirmities. Their bodies weren't aching anymore. Their minds weren't hurting anymore. That's something that he did on the Sabbath, which ironically is a day of rest. It's pictures when God at creation had created everything in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. And therefore he hallowed it. He made it special. He made it holy because he rested from his works. In fact, he gave it to Israel. He said in the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall work, but the seventh is the Sabbath of the Lord. In it you shall not work, neither you, nor your sons, nor your daughters, nor your manservants, your male employees, and your female employees, that they may rest. So it's actually the commandment is to keep holy what God says is holy, because God himself rested. It's following the example of God, but it's also giving everybody else a rest too. You don't work people to death. You can overdrive animals, you can overdrive people. You got to give it a rest. Even your pieces of equipment, physical things, need a rest. If you overdrive some drill bits, you heat them up and you destroy them. It's the same thing with human beings and animals and nature. Nature rests, right? Goes through summer and winter, goes through its seasons. It's a type of rest. So the idea of rest is everywhere in nature. It's something God himself did. It's something that he wrote in stone. And Jesus himself gave people rest. He promises people rest. And they rested on the Sabbath. Jesus did. He didn't follow all the extra rules that the Jewish religious leaders made up, but you'll find that human being as a whole, and you'll find that religious leaders in particular can have this habit of adding extra rules and regulations so that you obey them, which is just a burden. You can tax people to death, you can talk people to death, you can not give them rest and they'll die. So it's all about actually behaving the same way God did, because not having rest will kill you. Physically, mentally, emotionally, and Jesus said spiritually. And then Jesus says, hey, the Sabbath was not made, man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was actually made for man, because that's the way we're created. We need a certain amount of rest. It's a biological fact. In fact, your body is so hardwired that if you don't give it rest, it will go to sleep on you. It just vacates. Doesn't matter what you're trying to do. Bloop. You see videos of people, animals, all over. They fall asleep. The body says, enough. Blink. Rest is a demand that you can't resist. oh, you can take your drugs and all this other stuff. But eventually the body says, enough's enough. And so, this came up because I was talking to some religious people on, man, they're probably believers in Jesus, on Facebook. And I said, well, what do you mean by Sabbath? And so I went through the physical aspect of it, because there's a lot of mainstream Christians that say, oh, well, you don't have to keep that commandment, that command to be holy, that command to do what God has programmed into every living thing, right? They just do away with it because, because actually if you follow all of the rules that God put in the Bible, you also have to give your mouth a rest on the Sabbath. Because it says, it's written in the prophets. In Isaiah, he says, if you keep your feet off my Sabbath, if you keep from doing what you want to do, if you keep from saying all the words you want to say. So the Sabbath is about giving it a rest, right? Including your mouth, which we really need to do many times. Just give it a rest. It's actually part of the Sabbath commandment, which might be why they congregate on the first day of the week. Because if these ministers were actually doing all this speaking and making up all their own rules like they do and just rattling off at the mouth on the Sabbath, they would be doubly guilty. Maybe triply guilty, because they're not giving their mouth a rest. So yeah, they like to do away with the Sabbath because, for whatever reason, they just don't want to give it a rest. They don't want to obey God. They don't want to just sit and listen. They don't want to follow God's example. They somehow take Paul's writing, who said, no, we're supposed to keep the commandments that Jesus Christ set to us. We're supposed to follow Jesus Christ's example. I mean, in fact, Paul said, if anybody doesn't consent to the doctrines that Jesus taught, don't listen to him. Think about that one. And Jesus demonstrated, kept the Sabbath in every way, shape, and form. And he says, I will give you rest, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. In fact, Jesus said, I'll take your burdens. That's part of the kingdom of God. That's the good news. You don't have to be burdened by your sin and all this other stuff that men want to put on you. And you can see it in the Sabbath commandments, if they would actually get into the book and read what the book actually says. And if you read a lot of the old laws in the United States, these people who were worshiping on Sunday, they were keeping Sunday just like the Jews keep the Sabbath on the seventh day of the week. They weren't working. They didn't open their businesses. A lot of those people were actually keeping a Sunday, the Sabbath on Sunday, as opposed to the Sabbath on the seventh day of the week. They were keeping it on the first day of the week. And that goes way back to they didn't want to be mistaken for Jews, So when it comes to, what do you mean by Sabbath? Well, Jesus said the law's not done away with. And you can see it right there at creation. God rested. It's just following his example. He wrote it in stone twice, Points back to him being the creator too. So when you get to Hebrews and Paul says that there is a rest that remains, or actually, if you read the Greek, it's sabbatismos, it says there is a keeping of the Sabbath that remains, and then we enter into God's rest, which is not sabbatismo. It's another type of rest. It's a spiritual rest. So you actually do the physical things that Jesus Christ said. And then you see what God does for you. Because Jesus said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? You know, if you don't believe what Moses wrote, you won't understand the spiritual thing. What I say is what Jesus said. He says, if you don't believe the earthly things, that I tell you, like, the law is not done away with. There is a Sabbath rest, and it remains. How will you understand spiritual things? Like Jesus gives rest for your soul, for your spirit. I mean, if you're working 9, 10 days at a crack, how does your mind and your soul actually rest? Jesus didn't do that. I mean, how can you do something that Jesus himself didn't do and then claim to be doing what Jesus did? It's a logical disconnect now, isn't it? So there is a rest that remains. And by faith, we do that. We just believe Jesus. Well, okay, I'll take this day of rest. And we don't run our mouths either. And we don't find all of our selfish pursuits. God actually spent time with Adam and Eve. So, oh look, we've got time to spend with God. And to this point, it's still legally protected in the United States. The employer can't force you to work on the Sabbath. Well, this is my belief, I'm following Jesus Christ, you know. It's still law in the land. In fact, in Wisconsin, if the employer wants to make you work more than 7 days in a row, they have to get what did they put it? There has to be an agreement with the state of Wisconsin. You have to petition the state to make your employees work more than 7 days in a row. And the person who you want to work more than 7 days in a row has to agree. I mean, the people who wrote the laws in the United States were some very deeply religious people, and a lot of them were Christians, and some of them were just naturalists. They understood the law. They knew what slavery was. I mean, you work people to death. You control people's lives, and some of them didn't like it, and some of them, what the heck, you know. And then we had a civil war about that. Give them rest, give them freedom, give them liberty. So Jesus relieved burdens on the Sabbath. You know, people could rest. Imagine not having back pain so you could just go home and sleep. That would be so cool. Without pains and aches. Have you ever laid in the hospital with a physical injury or at home? And you really can't sleep because, you know, this part of your body aches or that part of your body aches or your insides ache. Or, you know, be a pregnant woman and have a child inside of you bouncing around and you try to sleep when they're, as I've heard women say, yeah, try and sleep when the little guy's pushing on your kidneys. You know? So we need rest. And Jesus promised to give us rest. So when Paul said we enter into his rest, and that there is a Sabbath that remains, that doesn't do away with, not even in its basic Greek, that doesn't do away with a physical Sabbath. Because he said, there is a Sabbatismos, a physical Sabbath that remains. And by believing, then we enter into the other rest that Jesus gives, which is not just physical, it's the spiritual aspect. It's relief from sin and the burden of sin. It's forgiveness. So Jesus in the Sabbath, a rest that remains. Everything needs rest. It's everywhere in nature. But be careful, there are people who twist the writings of Paul. And they disagree with what Jesus said. And they go against obvious laws of nature. obvious laws in nature. And the United States was founded, our independence was founded on the laws of nature and of nature's God. And the God who created nature also rested on the seventh day from work. And Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. Who wants to toss away what Jesus said was made for us? You want to toss away the oxygen? You want to toss away fresh water? You know, you want to toss away the earth? Somebody comes along and says, you don't need a good night's sleep. You don't need clean air. You don't need good food. Oh, wait, where have we heard this before? Same thing. Men and their rules that burden people down. When Jesus said, come to me and I will give you rest. And the Sabbath, which is physical rest, is not done away with. In fact, your body needs it. And one of Jesus' servants was inspired to write, if you don't give somebody what is needed for their flesh, food, clothing, rest, water, fresh air, if you don't give them what's needed for their flesh, he says, how does the love of God abide in you? And think about it. When Jesus judges his people, he will say, you saw me poor, you saw me naked, you saw me without food, you saw me without water, you saw me in prison, and you didn't help me. That's what Jesus will say to some people who he referred to as goats. People need rest. People need forgiveness. People need other people to stop running their mouths. At least one day a week, please. Please, at least one day a week. Hear Jesus. Follow Jesus. Enter into his rest. As he said, in every way, shape, and form. God bless. And sometimes I get a little personally peeved at this one because it is so obvious in nature that we need rest. For somebody to come along and say, oh, well, that's not necessary. You almost wish that they would, well, you don't want to wish them any harm, but because Jesus said, God bless, but it's like, haven't you ever been so tired you just fall asleep? And you want to grab the people and shake them. He says, don't you understand these basic facts of human existence? Jesus probably said it so much more peacefully. Although it said of Jesus, he was going to heal somebody on the Sabbath. And these guys wanted to kill him for breaking the Sabbath. And they wouldn't heal people on the Sabbath. That Jesus himself in the flesh looked at these men in anger. He was angry with them because they would not let somebody, they didn't want somebody to be relieved of a physical burden on the Sabbath. That's how twisted some minds get. And Jesus was angry. He just looked at him in anger. He goes, that's not what the Sabbath was made for. Nor is it tossed away. So it gets one of those things that it kind of riles you up people don't get some of the basic things that help people stay alive.